Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in light of the fact that the Flag Smashers are the main villains in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, or at least the villains that we're currently seeing, I still say that they're basically being used by Helmut Zemo for his own ends. No idea what his ends are, but probably to kill superheroes, to like wipe out all the superheroes on Earth. That seems to be the most basic premise given everything that's happened, but I don't know if that's really true or not. I figured we'd do a video on the Flag Smasher. Now, here's a funny thing. Contrary to what you may believe from his name, Flag Smasher or Karl Morgenthau is not really just running around smashing flags. Although it would be funny if he was. I mean, technically he was in his first issue, in his first appearance. We'll talk about it here in a second. He was really smashing flags, but that's not really his thing, right? To like throw the American flag on the ground and stomp on it with vigor. That's not really his whole, that's not really his MO. It'd be amazing if it was, but that's not really his MO. So Flag Smasher first appeared in Captain America issue number 312 back in 1985, and he was created by Mark Grunwald. But the funny thing about this is that Flag Smasher had a kind of unofficial three-part story with Captain America. And the reason why I say unofficial is back then in the the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you kind of had multi-part stories, but not in the same way that you do now, right? Like now, if you go and you buy really any particular comic, it'll just be like part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, all the way up to part 6, right? Or sometimes even part 7 or 8, even as many as 12, if you're going for like a maxi series. And so the result of this is that back then, it was all just kind of a loose series of stories that were being told. Now, a lot of that just came off the heels of Chris Claremont and his X-Men run. That's why his run was so landmark, because it changed the way the comics were written in Marvel. That Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did kind of maintain that to a degree, but by the time that Chris Claremont came on, you had Roy Thomas, who was taking notes from the success of Chris Claremont. You had Steve Gerber, who was doing the same thing, Mark Grunwald. It was par for the course to like take notes from just the monumental success that Claremont was getting with X-Men and then apply it to everything else. And so while the first appearance of Flag Smasher came in issue 312, the second part was in issues 321 and 322, followed by issues 348 and 349. So it was kind of an unofficial 3-part series. But the idea behind this is that when he first shows up on the scene, really in the first issue, we're given a combination of both his actions as well as his motives. And that's one of the big differences, is that back then, the origin of a character was usually given as some kind of a flashback sequence in the comic book, or they would muse it to themselves. In this instance, it was him just kind of reflecting on why he was doing what he was doing and just sort of musing to himself. But the idea is that he was the son of a Swiss banker, and that his father had basically left the idea of finance behind and instead championed the idea of world peace. The problem with this is that his father was ultimately killed. And so the belief of Karl Morgenthau was that his father was basically too light-handed in his approach with regards to how peace needed to come about. Now again, this is another example of Marvel looking at the success of the X-Men and then rolling it over. Magneto is really the character that this guy's modeled after, right? The Magneto was the guy who believed in creating not really a peaceful coexistence, but basically eliminating the threat of humanity against mutants, and would actually do things to essentially eliminate humanity, right? There was one point in the stories where he implemented a worldwide EMP, a blanket EMP across the globe, and basically took down technology all across the world. That's the set of events that almost led into Fatal Attractions. And then once he actually did launch Asteroid M, or really brought it back, that's what led into Fatal Attractions itself, when he stripped the adamantium out of Wolverine's body and things like that. The important thing here is that the motives behind Flag Smasher doing what he's doing comes by way of the fact that his actions in showing up at the UN and destroying the flags, and then going to the biggest flag manufacturer in the United States and destroying that, draws the attention of Captain America. And the result of this is that Captain America goes to publicly make a speech in order to essentially draw Flag Smasher out, which works. But when Flag Smasher shows up here, because nobody really understood his motives, the Captain America is actually thrown in a tough spot. And the reason why is because the stance of Flag Smasher is to say that he doesn't really believe in the idea of nationalism, right? He doesn't really believe in the idea of America or the Soviet Union or any of those. Instead, he sees the idea of people declaring themselves to be part of a particular nationality, right? So to be American or to be South African or to be Russian is basically a way for them to say, I am something you are not. And a lot of that really is predicated on how that particular country is doing relative to others. So there's a kind of arrogance or pomp and circumstance that comes along with it. But he sees that as more of a problem for humanity, that humanity could achieve so much more if it would simply cast aside the notion of borders and then operate as a singular cohesive unit. The problem with this is that, like so many instances in the past, even here in the real world, the message gets lost in the conflict, right? Let's go on a journey for a second, because we always do these real world comparisons to comic books, right? Let's go on a journey for a second. Let me tell you guys a story. Back in the early 1990s, there was a man by the name of Larry Gilbreath, and Larry Gilbreath was a UPS driver, and Larry Gilbreath was dropping a package off to a compound as he'd done so many times before. The difference is that this package fell and broke open, and when it did, he realized inside of it were automatic rifles and grenades and things like that. He reported his findings to the local police, who informed the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The ATF ended up getting a warrant after doing their own investigation to search the compound, and when they got to this place, which was located in Waco, Texas, that when they tried to execute the warrant, they were fired upon, or supposedly fired upon, by the Branch Davidians, who were the people inside this compound and were led by a man named David Koresh, who'd been preaching this idea that the world was ending, so they had to like stockpile weapons and things along those lines. This ultimately led to the FBI intervening, which went into a 51 some odd day standoff, where at the end of which the FBI raided the compound and the firefight ensued. Fire was set in 3 different locations, and when the smoke cleared, 70-something Branch Davidian men, women, and children had died. Now, in response to the actions of the federal government in Waco and their actions at Ruby Ridge the year before, a former member of the US military named Timothy McVeigh had decided that the American government had become too tyrannical and intended to use its own foreign policy against itself by filling a moving truck full of Zyklon B, driving into the federal building in Oklahoma City and blowing it in half. But if you ask anybody about Timothy McVeigh, they'll never tell you what he talked about in his one-page manifesto. They'll say he's the guy that blew the Oklahoma City building in half, right? The message gets lost in the actions, and that's the problem that Flag Smasher's facing at the moment, right? The issue that he has is that with him going through and committing what are deemed to more or less be terrorist acts, that while his motivations are sincere, and Captain America even recognized that in their initial encounters, like, look, I get where you're coming from, but the important thing to understand here is you're committing terrorist acts in the name of a greater good, that this leads to people losing sight of what it is that he's doing. Ultimately, he's called a communist, and everybody tears him down, and they're like, get out of here, commie, and all that kind of thing, and they ultimately end up deporting him from the United States. They boot him out of the country, which kind of sucks. The thing about this was that Mark Gruenwald wanted to create a character that was not really your villain of the week, right? He wasn't really a guy who was showing up to rob banks, you know, or implementing some scheme where it was a distraction here, but he was actually doing something over there, because that had been done to death, right? That was the cornerstone of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's storytelling. And I don't really say that to tear down Stan Lee or Jack Kirby. I simply mean to say that by the time you got into the mid-1980s, because of stories like the X-Men, because of what DC was doing with regards to a lot of their superheroes, making them more tangible, more grounded, more relatable, this basically meant that you had to make villains similar to that, right? The evolution of Magneto running all the way up to Uncanny X-Men number 200 and the start of his redemption arc is all kind of testament to that, right? The idea that you know, villains are, or at least can be, far more interesting than the heroes. And so creating a character who is vying for this idea of unifying the world in a way that had never been done, but doing this through what are in effect violent means, really provoked a lot of philosophical thought and even debate among fans. Is it one of these situations where the ends justify the means, right? Do you look at that and just say, hey, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? I mean, that's just kind of the way it goes. But regardless of how you slice it, the important thing is that with Mark Gruenwald kind of continuing this trend, that with Captain America issues 321 and 322, he introduced a group called Ultimatum. Now, Ultimatum stood for Underground Liberated Totally Integrated Mobile Army to Unite Mankind. It's a mouthful. I totally get it. Hence the reason why they call themselves Ultimatum. But they were, by all standards of measurement, a group that followed the charter of Flag Smasher. And we even were kind of organized and inspired by him with regards to the things that he had done. And the idea here, at least the way it intentionally went down, is that you basically had Flag Smasher taking a plane hostage and then making a broadcast to the world and essentially saying, like, Captain America defeated me in our first encounter, that's true, but it was just blind luck, right? That's the only reason why he did it. I'm obviously the superior fighter. The two of us should fight to the death, and then if anybody intervenes, I'm going to kill everybody here, right? I don't want to hurt them, but I will if I have to. Now, of course, this led to S.H.I.E.L.D. intervening and then assisting Captain America, and then, of course, you know, Carl Morgenthau being taken down again. But the important thing to get here is that this was sort of the way his character functioned in these early days. The problem with this was that you can't do the same gag twice, right? You got to move on to the next gag. And so what you ended up getting is that in Captain America issues 348 and 349, Mark Gruenwald introduced the idea of Red Skull and basically established this notion that Red Skull had actually been the one that was funding Ultimatum, and then basically used that as a way to oust Flag Smasher from his own group. The problem with this is that by the time this had happened, Steve Rogers had basically been forced out as Captain America by the Commission on Superhuman Activities and was replaced by John Walker, by US agent. And so when you end up having Flag Smasher approaching Captain America with his help to basically take down Red Skull because their idea was to initiate a global EMP that would render all technology useless and actually cause more harm for the world than good. Then he was met by Captain America he didn't recognize, and the two of them actually went into blows, and he got the crap beat out of him. But this, of course, led to the two of them teaming up, and of course, you know, they ended up defeating the Red Skull. Now, with that story ending and Mark Gruenwald's time on Captain America coming to a close, right? He wrote from 1985 to 1995. The reality is that he was just ready to move on to something else, right? The notion of focusing almost explicitly and kind of bringing back this villain that really didn't resonate with Captain America fans all that often, despite the interesting nature of his stories and despite the fact that he was shopped around, basically meant that the Flag Smasher had essentially vanished for 9 years, right? That his last appearance was in Ghost Rider Volume 3, issue number 6 in 1990. We didn't see him again until 1999. And the reality behind this is we've talked again about the comic book bust of the 90s and the notion that by the time you got to 1995, 1996, the comic books, at least in Marvel Comics, were largely struggling just because of the collector's market, comic book fans almost killing the industry. And so that basically meant that by the time you got to the late 1990s, Marvel was basically doing everything they could to try to stay afloat, bringing back old characters, reworking old characters. It was really one of these things where it was just throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And so with Captain America Annual 1999, Joe Casey wrote a story where you have essentially had Karl Morgenthau who came back, and he was basically captured by the Roxxon CEO, Calvin Halderman, and then turned into almost a sort of Incredible Hulk-esque character, right? Not exactly. He was just giant, gray, and mindless, but the deep philosophical discussions of Mark Gruenwald's Flag Smasher were basically gone, and instead he was just used as a means to eliminate competition or to take out people who were investigating Roxxon, right? Because Roxxon is kind of this super subversive, terrible organization that exists out there and has its hands in some pretty shady stuff, right? So think of like Facebook before Facebook. But the important thing is that ultimately, once he was able to regain his sanity and return back to normal, there wasn't a whole lot doing with him, right? You got Citizen V and the V Battalion, the Everlasting issues number 1 through 4, and then you got Cable and Deadpool issue number 28, and that was really kind of it, right? I mean, the way it all played out is that it looked as though he was assassinated by Domino in the Cable and Deadpool run, but that was really just a way for Marvel to just kind of get rid of his character, right? That he was kind of seen as this holdover, this unnecessary being that was there, and it was just kind of done for the sake of doing it, right? I mean, by that point in time, nobody was really asking whatever happened to Flag Smasher, so it wasn't as though there was a motivation for actually getting rid of his character. He was just kind of treated as a villain of the week at that point in time. But at the very least, he was a character that started out with these really interesting philosophical viewpoints on how to make the world a better place, but did so through some pretty terrible means, only for Marvel to basically shuffle him off to the cornfields when Mark Gruenwald was done writing Captain America, and that was essentially it. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.